Here comes the sun, here comes the sun, and I say it's alright. Little darling, it's been a long, cold, lonely winter. Little darling, it feels like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun, doo-doo-doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's alright. Little darling, the smiles return into the faces. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun, doo-doo-doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's alright. Sun, 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 here it comes. Sun, 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 here it comes. Sun, 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 here it comes. Little darling, I feel that ice is slowly melting. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been clear. Here comes the sun, doo-doo-doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's alright. Here comes the sun, here comes the sun, and I say it's alright. Sun, 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 here it comes. Sun, 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 here it comes. Sun, 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 here it comes.
Our opening words this morning are from Omid Safi. Community does not descend down from heaven. We have to shape it right here on earth. We all crave belonging and a sense of community. We are not meant to be alone. We deserve both solitude and connection. Community is not merely a gathering of individuals coming together. Community is an almost alchemical reaction that happens among all that we are capable of being and becoming. This community is heavenly, but it does not descend from heaven. We have to seek it, work for it, and build it here and now. At this time, I invite you to rise in body or spirit and join me in our opening hymn, Faith of Our Mothers. And the lyrics of this song are in your order of service. And now it's time for our message for all ages. Do we have any young folks in the audience today? Holy mackerel. There's a few. All right, come on up front. I could give you each a microphone.
We're fine. We can share.
Good morning. It's good to be with all of you. I know some of you were expecting my twin brother, Mark Hunter, but he couldn't make it, and he asked me to come in his place. And it is good to be here. Children, do you like to pretend? Yeah. Do you like make-believe stories? Yeah. What we're doing here is a make-believe story, a pretend story. And because this is Mother's Day, it's a story about mothers. Yeah.
Now, the book of Genesis, which is the first book in the Bible, tells us about how things began. On the sixth day of creation, the first chapter explains, God created human beings, men and women. Now, creating men wasn't too hard, but God had to really struggle with the creation of women because they were the mothers.
So I'm going to play the part of an angel, and Kerry.
I'm God.
Yep. Dear God, have you seen what time it is? You're working overtime on this creation. What's it going to be?
Well, if I ever get this right, she will be the first human mother.
What's the problem? Why not knock it off for the day and finish her up tomorrow?
You should see the specifications. She has to be easy to maintain, no artificial components, and nerves of steel.
That shouldn't be so hard for you.
A lap big enough for 10 children to sit on at once, but she herself has to be able to fit into a kiddie's chair. She has to have a back that can carry everything. And she has to be able to mend everything, from a scraped knee to a broken heart. And she's supposed to have 6 pairs of hands.
6 pairs of hands? No way.
Hands are easy. It's the 3 pairs of eyes that are slowing me down.
Why in the world?
1 pair to look through closed doors while she asks, "What are you doing in there?" even though she already knows the answer. A 2nd pair at the back of her head to see what she's not meant to see, but needs to know about. And of course the pair at the front that can look at her child and let him know that he's behaving badly and better change his ways, while at the same time letting him see how much she loves and understands him, or her, as the case may be.
I think you'd better go to bed now. Get some sleep.
Can't do it. I'm almost there. I've nearly created a being who heals herself when she's ill, who can delight 30 children with 1 birthday cake, who can persuade a 3-year-old not to eat clay, a 6-year-old to wash her hands before meals, and a 9-year-old that feet are for walking, not kicking.
She looks kind of soft.
Soft, but tough. You wouldn't believe the wear and tear she'll have to tolerate.
Can she think?
Not only think, but reach wise judgments and essential compromises. And she can do more than that. She can forget.
There's a leak. You're trying to get too much into her.
That's not a leak. That's a tear.
What's that for?
It flows whenever she feels joy or grief or disappointment or pride or pain or loneliness or the depths of love. You might call that tear her overflow valve.
You think of everything.
Whatever. Let's call this project complete.
And Mother through all time will live happily ever after?
That, dear friend, is not up to you or to me.
if you're not familiar with this tune by Van Morrison, at the end of each line, there's a little refrain. There'll be days like this. When it's not always raining, there'll be days like this. When there's no one complaining, there'll be days like this. When everything falls into place like the flick of a switch. Well, my mama told me there'll be days like this. When you don't need to worry, there'll be days like this. When no one's in a hurry, there'll be days like this. When you don't get betrayed by that old Judas kiss. Oh, my mama told me there'll be days like this. When you don't need an answer, there'll be days like this. When you don't need a chance, there'll be days like this. When all the parts of the puzzle start to look like they fit in, then I must remember there'll be days like this. When no one steps on my dreams, there'll be days like this. When people understand what I mean, there'll be days like this. When you ring out the changes of how everything is. Well, my mama told me there'll be days like this. Oh, my mama told me there'll be days like this. Oh, my mama told me there'll be days like this. Oh, I must remember there'll be days like this. There'll be days like this.
Philip Gulley and James Mulholland are Quakers, one a minister and the other a theologian. This reading is from their book, If Grace is True, Why God Will Save Every Person. I believe God will save every person. I remember the first time I heard these words. I was talking with a good friend. We were decrying some act of evil. I argued back. Even hell is too good for some people. My friend cringed when I spoke those words. He hesitated and then said softly, I don't believe in hell. I believe God will save every person. I was shocked. My friend was a faithful Christian and a thoughtful person. We'd spoken often of God, the church, and the world with little disagreement. I'd never suspected him of such heresy. I said, how can you believe that? He replied, how can you believe that God's grace isn't sufficient, that many of God's children will languish in hell forever, that they'll never be restored to their heavenly parent, that evil will claim victory in so many lives? How can you believe that? My friend acknowledged that believing God would save all his children was a less traveled path, but he disputed my claim that universal salvation was a New Age phenomenon. He told me of Origen and of Gregory of Nicaea, the early church fathers who believed in the salvation of all people. He spoke of champions of God's grace, seldom tolerated and often silenced in other generations. He pointed out the scriptures that led these saints to consider a different ending to the human story. He challenged me to ask the question they wrestled with, why must some be damned? Could I give an answer other than the Bible says so? Fred Mueller, for many years, until he retired at the end of last year, was the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Annapolis. Our second reading is from the entry for grace in his book, Heretics' Faith vocabulary for religious liberals. In our Unitarian Universalist heritage, we see in our Transcendentalist roots the blending of Eastern Orthodoxy's grace in nature and Western Christianity's grace as a private matter, with this blending now emerging as contemporary paganism. The core of a modern understanding of grace is this: it is unexpected. You don't know when the blessings will occur. It is undeserved. There is nothing you can do to earn grace. And yet it is everywhere, all about you. You don't have to be in the right place. Timing means nothing. But there is only one catch. Like any other gift, the gift of grace can be yours only if you'll reach out and take it. Hence the mystery that makes grace amazing. While on the one hand, you can't do anything to force grace because grace happens, at the same time, you don't create the opportunity. If you're not open to it, if you're not willing to receive it, then there will not be grace. Grace is the affirmation that worth and dignity are inherent to us, to who we are as human beings. Regardless of the mistakes we make, the tensions we might create, regardless of what society might tell us, we know we are valued. Or in more traditional language, the grace of God means something like this, and this is God speaking. Here is your life. You might never have been, but you are here because the party wouldn't have been complete without you. Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Do not be afraid. I am with you. Nothing can ever separate us. It is for you I created the universe. I love you. That's a very powerful message, perhaps overwhelming. In part because of the negative messages we can't seem to turn off, the larger culture's gospel that preaches that our worth, our value is measured by what we think, what we produce, the color of our skin, our age, our gender, our sexual orientation. Society reminds us that we are not affirmed merely for being human, but the blessings of grace declare and affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person.
Born a poor young country boy, Mother Nature's son. All day long I'm sitting singing songs for everyone. Sit beside a mountain stream, see her waters rise, listen to the pretty sound of music as she flies. Ba da 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 da. Ba da 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 da. Ba da 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 da. Find me in a field of grass, Mother Nature's son. All day long I'm sitting singing songs for everyone. Ba da 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 da. Ba da 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 da. Da 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 da.
A sermon on grace could be about a number of different things. One could probably devote a whole semester's worth of sermons to the various concepts that go by that name. But did any of you suspect that I'd start a sermon on grace by talking about my grandmother? Well, it's Mother's Day, isn't it? And my grandmother was named Grace by her parents. The name was an appropriate choice. After all, her father, the Reverend Herbert Erastus Davis, was a Presbyterian minister, and Grace is a good theological puzzle. But what you may be wondering is the connection between, on the one hand, my grandmother's name, Grace, and the theological concept that presumably was behind it, and on the other hand, grace notes in music. And how do these examples of grace relate to the grace that one may or may not say before meals? I had never been bothered by these questions. Indeed, I had never even thought of them until I decided that every minister, even UU ministers, should preach on grace at least once. And what was I waiting for? So let's take a look at grace notes and before you eat grace. Why are grace notes called grace notes? They are something extra, an embellishment. They are notes not really needed for the melody, but a free gift for the composer or the musician to the listener. Let's move on to the before you eat grace. You could call it a blessing. Both words are in common use. Saying grace before meal is a way of saying thank you for it. Grace and gratitude come from the same Latin word, gratia. Saying grace before meals is one way of practicing an attitude of gratitude. I like to remind myself that I'm thankful for the food, thankful for those who produced it and transported it and processed it and cooked it and served it. I'm thankful to nature for making it possible, thankful to be inside where it's warm and dry and not out in the cold and the rain. There's always a lot to be thankful for. Grace is a reminder of our interdependence. We couldn't survive on our own. And don't get too carried away. You don't want the food to get cold before you've had a chance to eat it. And I think it's beneficial for a family to eat together and to start their meal with a ritual of some sort, a ritual of gratitude and appreciation and togetherness. When I was growing up, the only occasions on which we said grace before a meal was when we were with my grandparents, my father's parents. Grace was always said either by my father when we were at our house or by my grandfather when we were at my grandparents' house. Apparently, grace is men's work. Everything else to make the meal a reality was done by the women. When my father said grace, he always said the same thing. My recollection is that it was the grace he learned at Olivet College. For these and all our blessings, the Lord make us truly thankful. Short and to the point, easily memorized. If I were to adopt this grace as my own, I'd probably leave the Lord out of it and say something like, for these and all our blessings, may we be truly thankful. Now, my grandfather had a formula that he always used, but I seem to have lost it entirely. I asked my brother if he remembered our grandfather's grace from more than half a century ago, and he responded, without much confidence, bless this food to our use and us to thy service. We never discussed this back then, but I wonder whether my father wanted his parents to assume that we always said grace before meals, whether they were with us or not. Now, I've assumed that my grandparents actually always did say grace before their meals, whether we were with them or not, but possibly they did it just for our benefit. Sometimes on our weekend visits to my grandparents after church, we would go to the college, that's Michigan State University now, we would go to the college for Sunday dinner at the Union rather than eating at home. I'm not absolutely sure of this, but I don't think that our food was ever blessed when we ate out. I'm now brave enough, with some encouragement from Kerry, to say grace in a public restaurant and even to hold hands while doing it. In Christian theology, grace is defined as a free gift from God. It's not something we earn. It's not something we necessarily deserve. It's not something we have to pay for. It's not something that justice requires. If God didn't give it to us, we would have no grounds for complaint. It's up to God's discretion. If you have to do something to get grace, if grace has conditions attached to it, it's no longer grace. This issue comes up in the most serious way when the issue is salvation. Will God save us from eternal damnation? Will God save us from the hell that we sinners deserve? I'm simplifying some here, but there are two basic answers. One answer is, if we do the right thing, if our lives are worthy enough, then God will recognize our moral desert, our good works, and will save us. The second answer, and this comes from Martin Luther, second answer is there is no way that we can satisfy God. We will always fall short. Our only hope is that God will save us, that God, through God's grace, will save us from what would otherwise be our fate, eternal hellfire. The first answer, salvation based on our conduct, is, roughly speaking, the Unitarian answer. Unitarians were and are believers in good works. And Unitarians never worried too much about the fate of their immortal souls, generally assuming that they were surely good enough, even if others weren't. The second answer, based on the grace of God, is, roughly speaking, the Universalist answer. Except the Universalists believe that God, a perfectly good and loving God, would extend this grace to all of humanity. Everyone will be saved. This raises the question, why were not all of those who believed in salvation by grace Universalists? Why did they assume that God's love might not extend to the whole human race? Here's the catch. God's grace, God's saving grace, is indeed available for everyone, but you have to accept it. You accept God's grace through your faith, your trust in Jesus Christ. This, you may think, is getting the works requirement back in, but through the back door. How do we know when our faith is adequate? Shirley Guthrie, the author of the textbook we used in my course in systematic theology back at Wesley Theological Seminary several years ago, Guthrie told us that viewing faith as just another requirement, as a hoop to pass through on the way to heaven, is a serious distortion. But here's his conclusion several pages later. If we want to receive the gift of the assurance of God's love, forgiveness, and acceptance, we must be willing to enter into the life of faith to do what faith requires. That still looks like a works requirement to me. I prefer the approach of universalism. Everyone is ultimately reconciled to God. All are saved. Now, I don't know if there's anyone in this room who is worried about the prospect of spending eternity in hell. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. But it is my guess that most of us know someone who has this worry. Feel free to share the good news of universalism with them. There is no hell. That's the simplest way of putting it. There is no hell. One more thought on hell before I go on to more pleasant topics. It seems to me that I would be unable to enjoy heaven if I knew that others had been sent to the other place. I would have to spend my time organizing until we convince God to shut down hell and to liberate those who had been imprisoned there, bring them all to heaven. Or let me put this another way. How can I enjoy the good and plentiful food that I eat every day when I know that millions of Americans rely on food stamps and millions more aren't even that fortunate? How can I enjoy the health care that is provided for me through Medicare and the federal employee health insurance system when I know that the Affordable Care Act never reached everybody, has never been fully implemented, has been significantly compromised in the last 16 months, and could still be repealed before November 2020? If we look at grace in a more general way, we can decide that grace doesn't require God. Let's set God and Christian theology aside and see what we can make of grace. Here's a story that was in the New York Times from the Metropolitan Diary column that appears every Monday. Dear Diary, at the beginning of this season, I found a matching hat and scarf in a tangle of turquoise and browns that perfectly complemented my winter jacket. Unfortunately, I lost the hat. Then, in mid-January, as I was leaving the Kandinsky exhibition at the Guggenheim, I spotted a lovely young woman, obviously with excellent taste, wearing the same hat. "Hey," I shouted, waving my scarf. We chatted for a few minutes, and I mentioned that I'd tried to buy a replacement hat, but the store had sold out. "Here," she answered, pulling off her hat and pushing it into my hands. No, I protested. "Take it," she repeated. "It would make me happy." When I tried to pay her for it, she insisted, "It's a gift." It got me to wondering what it would be like if all New Yorkers began to give gifts to each other or to tourists as a practice. I know I'm tucking a new umbrella in my shopping bag to give to a soaking wet stranger the next time it rains. An example of grace. Here's another one. The azaleas outside our front door are beautiful. an amazing sight, a beautiful scene. I have done nothing to deserve it. I've done nothing to make it possible. It's grace, amazing grace. Before I offer any more examples, I want to give you a chance to think of your own. In the next minute or so, and I'll keep quiet, to give you a chance to think. Try to come up with 3 examples of grace that you have received. And don't be alarmed. I won't ask you to share with your neighbor. I haven't given you 3x5 cards on which to write down your discoveries and then pass them to the center aisle. This is strictly for you. So give this some thought. Here are some examples that I've come up with. I've cheated, of course. I got to see the question in advance. I'm thankful to be alive. How we come to be alive is something that none of us can explain. We understand the biology of it, more or less, but why is that person who resulted me and not someone else? Why am I alive now rather than, say, 3,000 years ago? How do I happen to be a human being rather than a coyote or a cabbage? These are meaningless, perhaps quite silly questions, but really, isn't it a miracle that we're alive? Think of all the people that might have existed but don't. And especially today, think of mothers. Here's a second example. I'm thankful for the family I was born into, and especially thankful for my mother. I'm inclined to say that I chose my parents well, but I know it doesn't work that way. In any event, I am fortunate to have had a supportive family, a family that believes in education, a family that gave me a good start in life. I realize, let me hasten to add, I realize that not everyone is as fortunate as I am in this respect. I know I am fortunate. I know I did and could do nothing to deserve this good fortune. I know that there are those, probably here in this room, whose families have not been a blessing to them. For a third example of grace, how about the sun? Life would be impossible without it. Can we reject grace? Or can we fail to accept the grace that is offered to us? Shirley Guthrie, the author of the theology textbook I referred to earlier, appears to argue that we can miss out on the grace that God makes available for us. God loves us and wants to save us, but if we don't accept the invitation by having faith or trust in Jesus, then we can be lost. Gully and Mulhannon, in the reading I shared earlier, argue for a different position. For them, the grace of God is irresistible. But consider the second reading, the one from Fred Muir. Well, I'm sure there's no room for hell in Muir's cosmology. Muir appears to side more with Guthrie than with Gully and Mulholland on the irresistibility of grace. Recall what he says. But there's only one catch. Like any other gift, the gift of grace can be yours only if you'll reach out and take it. If you're not open to it, if you're not willing to receive it, then there won't be grace. The woman in New York could have turned down the hat. More generally, we can fail to take advantage of the opportunities that life gives to us. We can always look for the negative rather than appreciating the positive. We can complain rather than acting. We can be selfish rather than generous. We can isolate ourselves rather than living in a cooperative give-and-take community. We can block out of our awareness the beauty that surrounds us. There are many ways in which we can miss out on life, but why would we want to? A few minutes ago, I gave an example of grace, the beautiful azaleas outside our front door. But what if I were allergic to their pollen, and every year about this time I'm miserable until azalea season is over? What might appear to be grace to one person could be a horror for someone else. I mentioned that I had chosen my parents well. Of course, we can't choose our parents, but we sometimes take credit for achievements that were really gifts we received. It was, some of you will recall, Barry Goldwater who had the entrepreneurial sense to inherit a department store. Can we tell the difference between something we receive by grace and something we earn? Most things probably have a little of each. I recommend humility. Return to the woman in New York who was given the hat that replaced the one she had lost. For her, it was an example of grace. For the woman who gave it to her, it was an instance of generosity. She made a free gift. She was under no obligation. In the giving, she made the world a better place. Not much better, perhaps, but definitely better. Recall how the writer ended her story. It got me to wondering what it would be like if all New Yorkers and Philadelphians began to give gifts to each other or to tourists as a practice. I know I am tucking a new umbrella in my shopping bag to give to a soaking wet stranger the next time it rains. That's the kind of world I want to live in. That's what Jesus might call the kingdom of God if he were among us today. We cannot transform the United States in the next few months, but let's start with those of us right here, right now. Think of ways that you can be generous to others. Think of acts of grace that are within your reach. May our lives be filled with grace. May we recognize and accept the graces available to us, and may we be agents of grace. Amen.